of the subtle strategizing, crinkle his nose, already contorted by a long history of breaks, and say, "Let's just line up and knock them on their asses." Another player who was later traded was shocked to find new teammates who wouldn't play with injuries. "Our guys would crawl across broken glass with no clothes on to get to the field," he said. That made that team what it was. The Dolphins played the perfect season with chipped teeth, a splintered forearm, a bruised liver, a slipped disc, and broken ribs. And that was just one guy, defensive end Bill Stanfill. Others had broken arms, broken noses, you name it. Time would reveal a dark side to such intrepidness. Middle age and beyond would become a minefield of dementia and other concussion-related brain disorders, not to mention constant musculoskeletal pain to remind them of their old job. It was a team with the poorest owner in the league, a team composed largely of cast-offs and has-beens. One of the greatest offensive lines ever was assembled almost wholly from parts other teams had jettisoned. A number of crucial starters shared the scouts' dismissal. Too small and too slow. One defensive starter almost went to veterinary school instead. Another, the son of physicians, arrived via the unlikely NFL breeding ground of Amherst College. It was a team saved by a 38-year-old over-the-hill quarterback, coached by a 42-year-old wonderkind with a Leviathan chip on his shoulder. It's noteworthy how often players echoed a similar refrain. "I wasn't a gifted athlete. We weren't the greatest athletes." This wasn't really true, but it reflected an emphasis on intelligence, teamwork, and a work ethic forged in the struggles of many of their parents, immigrants in the American Midwest. The fruits of that labor unfolded in the unlikeliest of places. The greater Miami area was a quiet, relatively uncrowded sprawl of communities, a far cry from what it would become in the 1980s and beyond. The name Miami still evoked snowbirds in polyester suits playing shuffleboard on the beach, rather than fashion models and cocaine. Previous attempts at pro football in Florida had failed miserably, and the Dolphins franchise, the state's only major professional sports team, was still so young that most elementary school kids could remember its first season. 1972, despite ever-present racial and political tensions and continued national divisiveness about the war in Vietnam, was a simpler time in America. A simpler era in football, too, free of the trappings of a billion-dollar business. Not that the early 70s was a utopia of peace and harmony. The Dolphins marched to perfection in a season of war, political corruption, and barely veiled racism. But Don Shula managed to integrate his team, at least during business hours, and instill a sense of dedication and purpose that blinded them to anything that might distract them from his obsession, which became their obsession, to win every game until it was January 14th, 1973, and their Super Bowl debacle was supplanted by triumph. "They went 17-0, and it won't happen again," wrote a prescient Dave Anderson in the New York Times just days after the Super Bowl. "The chemistry is too involved and impossible to repeat, as if the test tube shattered before Don Shula had time to analyze the formula." Shula's laboratory assistants included offensive and defensive coordinators, often compared to college faculty, an offensive line coach who played bass fiddle and taught his men psycho-cybernetics, and a lone wolf scouting genius who gathered the parts no one else saw the value of. The spark to bring this perfect beast to life came the previous January in the form of a traumatic loss on football's biggest stage. When players and coaches all reassembled the next summer, they were joined in their leader's all-consuming drive to obliterate that failure and replace it with its opposite, ultimate victory. It all began, as every season did, with everyone running for 12 minutes in the sweltering Soup Bowl of July in Miami, while across the bay, as Neil Young would have it, freaks would soon streak down neon streets, podiums would rock, truth would leak, and even Richard Nixon had got soul. Pre-Perfect 1. Who are these guys? Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer. Richard III. On the morning of July 9th, 1972, 54 hopeful football players trotted out of the locker room at Biscayne College, a 20-minute Sunday drive north of downtown Miami. It was the beginning of the 7th annual Miami Dolphins training camp.